Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Let's Combinate. I'm your host, Subhi Saadeh, and today we are graced and honored, as I always say whenever I have a guest on the show. But it feels weird to say because the guest is not a guest, it's a very old friend. Joey is a senior technical program manager working in the medtech consulting space. He is now and will always be, in my heart, the DFMEA guy. We came up through the mud together. And I think I can't imagine a situation where I do more design risk assessments with anyone in the future, just given the amount that we did together. Welcome, Joey. It's good to have you, man.
Yeah, good to be here, Subi. Thank you.
So you and I did a lot of risk assessments together, Joey, and it's really a mixed bag as far as what you get out of a risk assessment. Like when we were going through them, there was always this disconnect between the device risk assessment and the drug risk assessment or risk assessments. Have you seen any improvement in that area, or does it still suck?
I would say that the processes are starting to get a little bit closer. I work with some pharma companies on developing their product, and they're purely the drug side of things, and we're working on their platform device. And so they still have a totally separate process in terms of the way that they approach risk with the drug. And then they just say, you're the device and you do everything on your own. Um, and then we'll just lump it in with our drug down the road. Whereas I work with a couple of drug companies that very early on started to integrate the device risk management process to their drug risk management process in terms of what the stability plans were and what their test plans were and how they were going to approach drug compatibility with the device container early on. And that's awesome because it helps out a lot on the back end in terms of having to redo things, in terms of assessments, retesting, whatever it may be. But you still see a lot of independence of the drug and pharma side from the device side in terms of how they approach risk, how they approach the device development process, and just treat them as totally separate entities until they have to treat them together.
When you say that they have like a totally different way of managing risk, what do you mean by that?
I think the FMEA process and the methodology in which we approach devices a lot of the time, so like fault tree analysis, FMEA analysis, isn't really the way that drug and pharma analyzes risk of their product. So the extremely methodical, score-based approach for the different outcomes, the different failure modalities, and then having that pivot into risk controls that then guide you through the design process. I don't think that the drug process necessarily works that way. I think it's a lot of early failing and discovery to try to find a mechanism of action that works. And then on the back end, looking for the failure points and like the issues to help refine your product down the road, choose a different target, different drug, different formula compound, whatever it may be. So I feel like the way that risk is built into the process feels a little bit different. I just know from our time back at Pfizer when we would go through the risk process for the device and how we needed to approach building out our design history file, the drug teams were like, what is this? How do you even do this document? And I think that there's still a lot of that today with the drug teams that I work with. Yet this is a weird approach to risk. We don't do it this way. Like, how do I read this document? I don't really know. And so I think that still exists, but there's some combination product companies that started with a molecule or a drug that's like their source of future growth or revenue or whatever it's going to be. And those companies recognize very early that they're a combination product. And so start to build in the device risk management process very early with the drug. So getting better, still not there.
One of the touchiest things when it comes to risk management, particularly when you have an outsourced component to the product development, is aligning like the different risk scores. So before you were in this role where you were working with a bunch of different development organizations, CMOs and stuff like that, or even depending on if you have like a centralized process at a big pharma company or you don't, when you're working with your internal sites, you may have different PFMEA methodologies depending on the site. And so years and years ago, and still today, I think one of the hardest things is aligning the risk processes so that you have an output that makes sense and that you're like level setting everything. And you may have an RPN score in one area that's like 1 to 100, or you may have a different score that is like 1 to 1,000. I don't know. I'm just like making those up depending on if you have a severity scale of 1 to 5 versus 1 to 10, et cetera, et cetera,
Yep.
et cetera. And I'm assuming I'm assuming you've seen a lot more case studies now than before. So what have you learned in terms of the traceability area?
It is it still hasn't gotten easier. I think working in a client facing capacity, a lot of times they already have a quality system with risk profiles characterized. So they have their own occurrence table, they have their own severity table, they have their own residual risk table or risk profile table based on the occurrences and severities. And so you just have to adapt to what theirs is. But there's always a storming process on the front end for what do you consider a 2 versus what do I consider a 2. And there's some people that are very by the book. This is what the occurrence level is saying based on the numbers. This is the data that we have, whether it's from complaints, field studies, like predicate devices. And so that's how we're going to define the occurrences. Um, and like this is, and then you have the other side, the severity definition, which severity definition is a really touchy subject as well, because I think that some organizations get really adamant about all severities have to be individually assigned by the medical officer, the clinical officer, whoever it is. Whereas I think some get a little bit more, let's set them as engineers and then just have them check it down the road. And so that like bit of unalignment is funky. I would say I haven't been in many capacities or experiences where you're using a different scoring system between different risk assessments. So like between DFMEA, UFMEA, SRA, and PFMEA, so far, all of those have been done in this to the same risk management plan that I've experienced. And I guess that's an area of setup on the front end, like really getting a robust risk management plan in place that's going to define what the approach is going to be, whether it is in the client's QMS and risk approach versus the risk SOPs that my company has. I don't think any way is necessarily better or worse. Probably, actually, the biggest discrepancy I've seen is when the software team wants to do P1, P2 methodology for scoring, whereas the device team has already done the DFMEA and just an overall probability scoring capacity. And so you have your occurrence table that defines occurrences, I think, for the overall scoring. So like a 1 is like 1 out of 100, 2 is 1 out of 1,000, whatever it is. But when you break it down to P1, P2, you have to break down those occurrence levels to an even further classification. And just estimate it because it's not defined in the risk management plan. And so that had to be defined, and that created, I think, some weirdness because on the software side, like you're supposed to assume technically the software will fail 100% of the time without a control in place or a line of code written. But how that figures into P1, P2, everybody has different interpretations. So I don't know. I think I just have to be like very easygoing. We'll just fit it together and it'll be fine as long as we adhere to the risk management plan. But there's still probably some of the most difficult meetings to get regulatory, quality, and then clinical medical on the same page with how the risk is being estimated from a frequency perspective and from a severity perspective, and then what the overall resulting risk is. Because I think sometimes they do the numbers and they're like, that shouldn't be a medium. That should be a low. And what does that mean? So I don't know. Yeah, I like the full traceability side of things. I haven't had a ton of problems with it besides mismatches between P1, P2 versus overall P estimations of probabilities.
Could you dive into what do you mean when you say P1, P2? Because it's coming out of the device methodology for if it's a
Oh
drug
yeah,
person who doesn't know or somebody who's not like super experienced with risk.
probability.
It comes out of 24971, so it's technically not
Yeah.
mandatory. It's more like a guidance thing. But what are you trying to accomplish with basically the P is a probability of occurrence, right?
Yep.
And then you can dive further in by basically separating into multiple probabilities. But on you go. I just wanted to add that context of where people can find it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in the simplest terms, P1 is the likelihood that the issue happens. So the failure occurs in the device and an issue occurs in the device as a person is using it with a patient, whatever it may be. And then P2 is the likelihood that issue with the device, the hazard that's associated with the device failure, then leads to a harm of the patient or the user of the device. So, like the probability that you're trying to get to at the end is that the likelihood of a failure occurring, but then also leading to a harm that negatively impacts a user or patient of the device. But breaking it down to P1, P2 kind of lets you say, yeah, that could happen, and it maybe will happen none of the time, but the likelihood that it really does anything to a patient is going to be extremely low. And so the resulting probability that it actually matters from a safety profile might be extremely small. And so your resulting risk is going to be lower. And breaking it down in that sense, I think just gives a more methodical approach that allows us as device development engineers to maybe like have a clearer thought process for a reviewer or somebody from a different pathway to understand why did we assign these scores. Because I think a lot of times people just say that's a two. You know, I think that's a two. How did you get there? The probability that it occurs is a three, but probably not going to be that big of a deal. Like they'll just get a new one, whatever it is. So let's make that probability that harm occurs a one, and then you get the resulting number of a two.
Right.
Um,
And then also the probabilities end up becoming a lot more, you end up having a lot more resolution around the probability of the harm occurring based on what that specific harm is
yep,
versus if you have it like aggregated into one big score,
yep,
it's hard to tell whether or not the probability is coming from like the potential hazard occurring or it potentially leading to that specific harm. And so you may have a situation where something can happen and it has the ability to lead to some harm, but the
yep,
likelihood that it leads to lower risk harm is a lot more than it leading to catastrophic or serious injury. So the same thing, like the P1 may be consistent, but it leading to severity 1 harm is much higher than it leading to S5 harm. So
yep,
I want to switch gears a little bit. I know you very well because like we worked together for 6 years or whatever it was. I think like one of the things that I saw you do that was unique is you just tried to bridge the gap. So you were in the design engineering team for most of your time. And basically the way that I perceived you is that you were part of a team that had a lot of very mature design engineers, call it like what 30 plus years average other than you basically. So you had like career design engineers, mold tool designers, people who would launch like 10 products and have lots and lots of patent plaques and stuff. And then you, and I think you're smart and brilliant and all that, but maybe not the same level of accolades at the time. And so what you did was like you tried to learn some of the design stuff, but you were on the design team and you learned everything else. And so you basically, I remember you were doing a lot of work with the systems engineering team, like doing design inputs and user needs. You were involved in some design validation studies. You were doing like TMVs of quality. So I'm like reviewing all your work. Like I do exactly what you were doing. And you're doing TMVs, like you're doing risk assessments. We did because we worked on platforms like tons of FMEAs. Like you also got involved in PFMEAs, and you were basically like the only design person spending basically like at least half their time doing a lot of that stuff. So was that like strategic? Did you see I'm not going to beat these guys, like I'm learning from these guys, so I'm not going to be like overperforming by I'm not going to out design like this person who's been designing for 30 years. It's basically impossible unless I take 10 years. And then by that time they may be retired, so it's pointless. What I'm going to do is bring so much value because their design muscle is strong, but my muscle is being able to bridge them into the rest of the team.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you hit it pretty squarely on the head. I guess I had a really good start at the beginning of my career where I was in a rotational program, and so I started in manufacturing and then pivoted up to the R&D group in Lake Forest, and I, like, technically was a rotational engineer, so I was rotating with the systems engineering group for a period of time, and then the development engineering group for a period of time, the design engineering group for a period of time, and I picked design, I think, for a couple reasons. When I finished that, I talked to the manager at the time, and I said, "Hey, I think design engineering is probably where I wanna sit because it's probably the most fun area to learn in the near term." And, yeah, I wanted to learn a lot of those design skills and front end product design, prototyping, development skills, but I think I realized pretty quickly that, yeah, it would take 15 years to get extremely fluent in product design to the point that I was an expert. And that's an awesome way to go. And there's people that I know that are still doing that that I graduated with that are killing it. And it's awesome. And I do wish that I could do some of the things that they can do in SolidWorks at the end of the day. But I think I recognized pretty early that it wasn't probably going to be my pathway. And my biggest strengths were understanding the technical aspects of design to the point that I could, yeah, bridge the gap, communicate between different groups really well. And I think I wanted to learn the product development process as much as possible. So, yeah, I think I tried to fill a lot of the holes that the design engineering team didn't want to get involved in. So, no design engineer wants to write a DFMEA. They want to provide the input to the DFMEA as the expert on the product design, but they don't want to write the document. And so I think that was one of the first things that I was like, I can do this. It's going to help me learn risk management better. And it's going to fill a team need at the same time because nobody was doing it. And it would get shoved on the systems engineer, or the design engineer would begrudgingly do it at the very end, but their heart wasn't in it. And so it was an interesting task where just like busy work, so to say, of populating a DFMEA on the front end was like just like mindless. You put your headphones in, you drink your coffee, and you like get the thing populated. And then you get to do the fun part of I didn't necessarily design the product, but I get to poke holes in the design as I review it to say this is an area of failure that we didn't necessarily consider of the device. And what does that mean in terms of the risk profile? Do we need to put any new features or mitigations in? But then coming from that early like manufacturing experience, I think I started to also stress a lot around, is this truly manufacturable long term? Do we have the right design from a manufacturability standpoint to allow this to be consistent, which would feed into the PFMEA side of things later on? And I think what I learned at that job, what I've learned at every job I've had, is nobody wants to do a PFMEA either. Like
Okay, yeah, never.
the design group doesn't want to do an initial PFMEA. The manufacturing group doesn't want to do a PFMEA. Nobody wants to do a PFMEA either. Um,
I
but
remember there was one time where we were trying to get a CMO that we were working with to write a PFMEA for a product configuration that they already had. We just wanted them to do the PFMEA a certain way to match up with our system. And they charged us a completely ridiculous amount of money to do it.
yeah,
And it's just like, nobody wants to do these. Nobody wakes up and is, this is my thing.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I think there is something to be said about just running towards the work that is like least attractive, but is very high value because like you end up seeing situations where even a very experienced design engineer, they may have their first draft, you could say, of their overall design, but as soon as you start poking holes in it, you realize, oh, hey, we have a pretty big gap to fill in this
Yep.
specific area.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a huge opportunity. Like the work that people don't want to do but has to get done is always an opportunity to become an expert in an area that other people aren't an expert in. So I think at that in that role, the risk assessment process and the linkage of the risk assessments between the design to the development systems engineers was a really big gap. The process side of things, the process development, is the design ready for manufacturing side of things was often an area that didn't go through heavy assessment and analysis early on or during the product development process. So those were two areas that I got, I think, really involved in. as we were going. But then, yeah, past that, I think that there were other areas that some people might have been strong at, but didn't necessarily get the opportunity because they were busy with other project work or whatever it might have been. So TMV and just like validation as a whole, yeah, I think is an area that oftentimes was outsourced. And the outsourcing of that work is crazy expensive. Like you said, like the work that people don't want to do, you can charge a really high premium for it because nobody wants to do it. But yeah, TMV, I can't remember how much we were paying per test, but it might have been something like $50,000, like per test of TMV to get done outsourced in a lab. And so I feel like there was one other development engineer that I tag teamed with quite a bit to just like really work through the TMV process in house, how we approached it with different surrogate parts as opposed to actual parts. So it was extremely repeatable. It like gave you really nice gauge R&Rs across the board. And then that fed into just getting a lot more involved in stats as well and just how to build really thoughtful experiments on the front end to give the best value and output on the back end to help feed into your design, your development, whatever you were doing. Um, so yeah, I think I just really took it as how can I use my time when I'm not doing design work and learning on the design end to like best become this critical essential person, both
Well
at this
rounded.
company, but then also at a future opportunity. Because at the end of the day, becoming an expert in the product development process and like moving up in that way is probably what I targeted as my goal. Um, and like I said, I didn't think that the way I was going to get there was just by being a straight design guy the whole way through. So fun overall. And I think I learned a lot through that process. And I got to have three different mentor managers in the group between design, development, and systems engineering, which, you know, is crazy because you're meeting with all these different people and like trying to do reports and updates and whatnot to three different bosses, so to say. But at the same time, I think, yeah, it was very valuable and it also maybe helped stave off some of the things are slow right now. Okay, I'm just gonna go do something else.
For my
And
other
like,
boss.
yeah. And then if it was just a weird slow period where there just wasn't really much that I could get involved in from a project perspective, I would go across the courtyard to the other building and be like, hey, supply chain. Do you need like somebody to help you out with supply chain and logistics for 5 hours a week right now? And then I got really good at Excel because I started helping out with a different group and shadowing in that group for a period of time. So it's, yeah, I think achieving a well-rounded background was what I targeted as opposed to necessarily expertise in one area. But I guess the area you could say I gained the most expertise in was risk management because I think that's what I did the most of. I spent the most time doing it, the most time collaborating with people on it, building it into the process. And then I've carried that into my current role. I think I work really closely with the design assurance and quality groups on the risk management process. And it's always review a DFMEA or UFMEA if I don't write it and try to be one of the people to help point out the gaps, the issues, or simplify things. Like, we don't need to be analyzing this failure. It's not realistic. Let's cut this
Yeah.
stuff out if it's just like creating
Let
fluff.
probability zero.
So I still love the risk management side and I wish I could do more. And when I am a little bit bored, I'll just say, what can I review? What can I help out with? Because I want to do stuff like that. And I'll still do stats for people. Like if the engineer is super busy or the engineer just isn't super strong in Minitab or whatever it is, I'll always just pop in and do some of the things that I was doing back as like a design engineer because I think it's still fun and it's like a
Yes.
break from the other work.
Now you're doing program management that is on the more technical side. You're focused in many ways in combination products. What are you seeing as far as some of the design trends? Because and I really don't like asking questions like that because it's I feel like it's very beginner interviewer. What are the considerations? What are the trends that you're seeing? But I think with a lot of companies moving towards off-the-shelf platforms and stuff like that, you don't really hear a whole lot anymore about bespoke or
Yeah.
custom. And so, what's up the pipe, man?
Yeah. I think it it still depends because I think I've worked with a few combination products over the past few years. I've been at this in this consulting role for 3.5 years now. And I've been on a couple where it starts extremely custom and the design is moving and there's so many features that differentiate it from everything on the market. They improve the user experience in every single way. Every single pain point that the user has, it meets every need. And that's like the design and the development. And you're in phase 2 and you're driving. And then design lock is
When
just,
you say phase two, you're talking about phase two clinical or phase two of planning and feasibility, like a basic
yeah,
design
sorry, yeah,
cycle.
design stages and the product development design control pathway for
So
medical devices combo products.
clarify the stage one, two, three, like
Yeah.
so that you can give the context later.
Yeah, so I think stage one is more of that initial feasibility and design work. Do we have something that works?
Is
Product
worth taking
definition.
through
It's
design control.
stage two is more the detailed design part of it. So, okay, we have a product, we have a need, we have the requirements that define the product, but we need to do the detailed design work to get it to a point where we call the design is locked, it's frozen, and we're ready to move into a verification pathway. And then stage three is the design verification side of things. So you're taking the device and you're evaluating the different design inputs or system requirements that you have of the device and verifying that those are met with the device product in a production equivalent build. So a build or batch that's actually built to those specs in a production equivalent environment. And then from there, you move into the validation side of things. So validating your process, starting to do tech transfer, doing summative evaluation of the product to make sure that the usability aspect of the product, the user needs are being met as well. And then 5 is that final transition,
Launch.
commercialization, regulatory submission, launch of the product that would transition to um, on market management. So when I talk about, yeah, stage 2 of the medical device combination product design process, it is the most underestimated, complex, difficult part that typically balloons in timing and cost because everybody wants to go for the device or product that differentiates them and meets every single need perfectly. Like you have all of your different user needs, your system requirements, and you want to hit every single one as well as possible. So you design this gorgeous, beautiful device that does everything. And when you do initial prototypes, it's yes, this is perfect. And then when you get into translating that to a manufacturable product, a product that's truly user friendly, and does all the things that you're going to claim it does, it always gets extremely difficult. A part failed. You skip doing like accelerated aging when you're doing your engineering, like feasibility testing. And then when you go to accelerated age the product, it fails because it's not as resistant to heat as you thought. One of your components is like melding to another component, it's decomposing, whatever it may be. Or like sterilization can screw up your product and you didn't do feasibility runs with sterilization. And then you find that like one of your components is not as resistant to gamma sterilization as you thought. Um,
Classic.
so it's just, yeah, this goes back to a project that we worked on together back in the day where just the sterilization process totally derailed the product.
One of the several sterilization process. Yeah.
uh,
So as far as because you were talking about basically companies thinking that they're going to go bespoke and then
yes.
they find themselves like, hey, we could just maybe go off the shelf and it would solve all of our problems. Is that what you're seeing? Like,
Yes and no. I would say I've seen a few situations happen. One is they go for broke and then it just like fails and fails. And so they have to pivot back and majorly simplify the design. So it's let's remove these 3 key features. And like an example of this, it's generic, is going for this really sleek auto injector. And you go for the sleek auto injector that does everything you want, and then it has a lot of trouble. And so I've seen people move away from that sleek auto injector to a more manual pen design that requires a little bit more user interaction. But at the end of the day, it's delivering the drug product successfully, consistently, with a good safety profile. So it's okay. Doesn't have as much differentiation, but it does what it needs to
it's
do.
okay.
Get
Right.
your drug on market. And that's like the biggest thing is you got to get the drug on market so that you can sell it and meet the patient need. And so I think there's the dream of being this beautiful differentiated product. And then a lot of times they roll back to simple. I've also seen the off-the-shelf approach, and not necessarily from a full system platform level, but from, let's say, like a subsystem level more. So it's like we can't get this subsystem to work. And so we found this subsystem, like the plunger barrel lure combo, that's working really well. And so we're going to put our dosing mechanism or whatever it's going to be on the back end of this system. We'll just adapt it to it because we can't get this part to work. So I've seen more of that, like a difficult subsystem or feature. You'll go out, you'll find one that's a little bit simpler, maybe not perfect, but it meets the need. And so
and design around it.
you just design around it and adapt your design. But it still depends on the group. It depends on how well funded they are, how much patience they have, how much timeline they have. Because in the drug world, you have to support clinical trials, but then you also have to think about the commercialized version of your device down the road. And so I think what I've now seen on 3 projects is they go for the complex, really nice device on the front. They realize it's difficult, and all they need short term is a device that's dosing clinical patients successfully. So they scale it back to something that's off the shelf, or they scale it back to a really simplified version of the device that they can do design verification for clinicals on to get it into clinical studies ASAP. And then they go back to the more complex product later so that they can launch something with confidence, but they can bring in the more complex device down the road once they have a guaranteed submission and launch date for the product. So,
Yeah, they may need to do bridging in that case, but like it
yeah,
becomes a risk benefit kind of thing. Joey, where can people find you?
I think LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me overall. I don't know. I'm not super active on platforms or socials or anything.
Awesome. Really appreciate you coming on, man. This was awesome.
Yeah, yeah, glad to talk always. I think we meet up to talk as friends, and then it's fun to talk in more of a professional capacity too.